Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm just going to give people a few more seconds to get in the room because we had a little bit of technical difficulty getting started this morning. If you are familiar with Zoom, you'll know that if you hover down at the bottom of the screen, there's a chat option you can select, and you can put comments or say where you're from, or just say good morning in the chat. You can also click on the Q&A option if you have any questions, and we'll try to answer those at the end of the presentation. So let's see. Wow, lots of people. Thank you all for joining me. The other staff is here too. You just can't see them right now. So, great. I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. Thanks for joining me for Coffee with the Curator. I'm Linda Hocking, and I am in charge of the Archives and Library at the Historical Society. By now, you've already heard a lot about Benjamin Tallmadge's importance during the Revolutionary War, the wealth he accumulated after the war, and his stature as an important member of his community. Today, I'd like to talk about some of the people in his life you probably haven't learned much about, based on some of the material in our collections. Okay, and we're going to get started with his wives. Unfortunately, there are no collections of their papers, no biographies of their lives, and trying to find information about women from this era typically requires one to sift through the papers and biographies of fathers, sons, or husbands. Sometimes we'll find an antiquarian book like Pioneer Mothers of America, though those rarely cite any sources. Here's what we know. Tallmadge's first wife, Mary Floyd, was the daughter of Major General William Floyd and Hannah Jones Floyd. Mary was born at Mastic, Long Island, New York, and her father was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Her mother, Hannah Jones, was described in Pioneer Mothers of America as, quote, a capable, well-brought-up girl. William Floyd inherited a large estate from his father at the age of 20, so Mary's childhood was likely a privileged one until the Revolutionary War. Anticipating the British occupation of Long Island, Hannah Floyd buried the family's silver and rushed her children aboard a ship to Connecticut, where they would take refuge with friends in Middletown. William was serving in the Continental Congress in Philadelphia when the British attacked Long Island. Hannah unfortunately never made it home. She died in Middletown in 1781. But following the departure of the British from Long Island, William returned with his children to find the home damaged and much of their property destroyed. We know a little bit about the courtship of Tallmadge and Floyd, but not much. It seems likely that there would have been some correspondence about such an affair, but the only words we have to describe it were written years later by Benjamin Tallmadge in his memoir. He recalled, quote, the autumn and winter of 1783 were devoted very much to these most pleasing and delightful visitations. Among others, not least pleasant and interesting, were those which secured to me a companion and friend, the most desirable in my view, had I been privileged with a choice from her whole sex. After visiting Connecticut, and arranging and settling my plans for a mercantile life in the place where I now reside, on the 18th of March, 1784, I led Miss Floyd to the hymeneal altar and commenced the life and duties of a married man. He went on to describe the day. The nuptials of Miss Floyd and myself were solemnized on the 18th of March, 1784, my honored father officiating, when General Floyd gave a most sumptuous entertainment to a great number of invited guests. Soon after our marriage, we paid a visit to New York, where we found a great number of friends with whom we spent a few weeks very pleasantly. We were treated with great hospitality by the family of Mr. Joseph Hallett, at whose hospitable abode we were invited to take up our lodgings. After his visit was ended, we returned back to Mastic, calling on our friends on the north side of Long Island and on Shelter Island, whom we wished to see before we departed to our abode at Litchfield, Connecticut. Remember the name Joseph Hallett, it'll come up again later. During the course of their marriage, Mary Floyd Tallmadge gave birth to 7 children, 5 sons and 2 daughters. In the entire 2 linear feet of the Tallmadge collection, There are two items pertaining to Mary Floyd. One is a eulogy written by Benjamin Tallmadge. The other, the only scrap of her writing in our collection, is her receipt or recipe book. In it, you will find recipes for things like George Washington's blackball, pickled cucumbers, cement for broken glasses or china, and syllabub. She died on June 3rd, 1805. On June 5th, Benjamin Tallmadge began her obituary with a verse. Though power supreme, whose mighty scheme these woes of mine fulfill, here firm I rest, they must be best, because they are thy will. Then all I want, O do thou grant this one request of mine, since to enjoy thou dost deny, assist me to resign. He concluded by saying this sad bereavement confers the solemn truth that neither virtue nor accomplishments, nor the fascinating charm and splendor of life can for a moment beyond its limited duration protract man's tender tie on earthly bliss. At the time of her death, Mary Floyd's children ranged in age from 4 to 19. Oddly, the collection contains no correspondence for the year of 1805. If Tallmadge wrote to his friends about her death, he didn't keep copies, and if they sent him condolences, he either didn't keep them or they were passed down through a different descendant than the ones we received these papers from. It was nearly 3 years later when Tallmadge wed Maria Hallett, the daughter of Joseph and Elizabeth Hazard Hallett, at whose hospitable abode Tallmadge had lodged with his first wife, Mary Floyd. Tallmadge was 22 years her senior, and the couple never had children together. Not much of her life remains either. There are a few notes to Maria Tallmadge Cushman, written on her husband's letters, a portrait, and a coffee urn thought to have been given to the couple upon their marriage. In 1829, Benjamin Tallmadge wrote a letter to Maria regarding his will. In it, he stated, "May God preserve you, my beloved wife, from all evil. And when you shall have finished your course on earth, may we meet in heaven to celebrate the praises of redeeming love through the merits and atonement of our crucified, risen, and glorified Redeemer." He died 6 years later in 1835. Maria lived another 3 years. The news of her death was sent to her stepdaughter Maria by Mary Pierce, who wrote, "To me is assigned the painful duty of informing you that your dear mother is free from pain and sorrow, and we trust is with her husband and Savior. No increased suffering gave warning of her death. This morning she gave her usual directions respecting her dress and the regulation of the room, showing her mind perfectly clear and active. An alteration in her breathing gave an alarm. Miss Halter sent for me, but she could no longer smile and hold out her hand when I approached her. Her breath grew faint, her pulse feeble, and while we gazed upon her, her spirit took its flight to heaven. Her death was as gentle as her life." Now we'll spend a little bit of time with Tallmadge's daughters. The oldest, Maria Jones, was born March 25th, 1790. She attended the Litchfield Female Academy from 1801 to 1802, which was a groundbreaking school for girls that taught ornamental and academic subjects. She may have learned to paint there. This watercolor was painted by her in 1870. In 1805, the same year Maria's mother died, she was 15 years old when she attracted the attention of a 20-year-old law school student named Virgil Maxey. Their on-again, off-again romance would end with them each marrying someone else. If you'd like to know more about it, I would suggest visiting our blog where there's a post from last week about a document in our collection. It's a letter from Tapping Reeve to Maria Tallmadge about their affair. In 1812, Maria did marry a law school student named John Payne Cushman. The couple moved to Troy, New York, where he practiced law. You can learn more about him in the Ledger, which is our database of law school and female academy students. Maria and John had 8 children. Sadly, they did not all survive to adulthood. When their youngest son, William Henry, died in infancy in 1833, his father wrote to the Tallmadges, "Our dear Julia will feel the stroke keenly. Oh, that it may be the means of teaching the surviving children that they must die, and that each may be the next victim of death in our family, and prepare to follow their deceased brothers." A few years earlier, in 1824, their daughter Maria Hallett Cushman died at the age of 4. Benjamin Tallmadge wrote, "We can hardly at this moment realize the solemn truth that our dear little beloved granddaughter, Maria Hallett Cushman, sleeps in the dust." Despite these tragic losses and her husband's death in 1848, Maria Tallmadge Cushman lived a long life. She died at the age of 88. Her sister, Harriet Walsworth Tallmadge, was 7 years younger. She also attended the Litchfield Female Academy between the years 1811 and 1814. She married John Delafield in 1821. Delafield's mother was a Hallett, and Maria Hallett Tallmadge was his aunt. So I guess you could say they were step cousins. She was 24, and his second wife, he was 35. They had 3 children who survived to adulthood. On July 10, 1856, Frederick Augustus Tallmadge wrote to his sister, Maria Tallmadge Cushman, "You and myself, dear sister, are alone left out of so large a family of children, monuments indeed of God's sparing mercy." A week later, he added, "Sister Harriet suffered exceedingly during the last few days of her life. Although the week previous she expressed to me a strong wish that I would take her to Litchfield, the air of which she thought would be so beneficial to her, which I promised to do as soon as she was able to go." She was buried on the 11th in a vault of Mr. Delafield's at St. Thomas's Church, corners of Houston Street and Broadway. As challenging as it is to find information about the women of the family, it's even harder to come up with details about the enslaved people and indentured servants who lived with the Tallmadge family. Much to the surprise of some, slavery existed in Connecticut for a very long time. According to the National Park Service, slavery in Connecticut dated back to the mid-1600s. By the American Revolution, Connecticut had more enslaved Africans than any other state in New England. In 1784, it passed an act of gradual abolition. It stated that those children born into slavery after March 1st, 1784 would be freed by the time they turned 25. As a result of this, slavery in Connecticut was practiced until 1848. Lynn Templeton Brickley, who lived in Litchfield and wrote her PhD on the Litchfield Female Academy, spent much of her time studying various aspects of Litchfield history. Her papers reveal what can be found by searching through Tallmadge's bills and receipts, as well as town records, newspapers, and a source one might not ordinarily think of, a historical fiction novel. In a draft of a lecture about African Americans in Litchfield, Lynn wrote, quote, "Veteran slave Tom Jackson belonged to Colonel Benjamin Tallmadge, who settled in Litchfield after the close of the war." She continued, "Records show that Benjamin Tallmadge added a number of Black children to his list of servants in the years after the Revolution. In 1784, he paid 36 pounds for one certain Negro boy named Prince, a 7-year-old who was to be a servant for and during his natural life. In 1787, he bought from Ezra Lahamadou in New York a certain Negro girl by the name of Jane, about 13 years of age, who was born a slave according to the laws of the state of New York." Lynn continued that Tom Jackson, a slave freed by Benjamin Tallmadge, was the founder of a large family of descendants who lived on the Milton Road. Jackson was said to have been the last slave to have been freed in Litchfield. He served with Tallmadge in the Revolution, and Harriet Beecher Stowe recalled her childhood memories of him in her book, Poganuck People. She recalled Jackson, named Cato in the novel, as an ancient Negro servitor of the colonel's who had once served as his waiter in the army and never recovered from the sense of exaltation and dignity conferred by this experience. She described him in uniform, mounted on a horse just behind that of the colonel in the annual 4th of July parade. Cato and his wife Venus served the Beecher family when they took tea at the colonel's home. Stowe's recollection of Cato's wife, whose name was actually Lucy Suma, is also in her novel. According to Brickley's research, she was a daughter of Laban and Clara Suma, and she lived on Milton Road and died around 1857. The scene that Stowe described in which the Beechers took tea at the Tallmadge house went like this. Soon Cato came in with tea on a waiter, followed by Venus, his wife, who with a high white turban on her head and a clear starched white apron in front, bore after him a tray laden with delicate rolls, sandwiches, and multiplied and tempting varieties of cake. Brickley also noted that, quote, it's hard to determine the status of some of Litchfield's Blacks, slave, indentured, or simply servant during the 1780s to 1830 period. She says that in 1788, Ruth Woodhull bound her Negro girl Abigail to Benjamin Tallmadge for 1 year for £4. It is unclear if Abigail was a slave or an indentured servant. According to the indenture agreement, Tallmadge further obligates and bind himself to return said Abigail to her mistress at George's Manor at the expiration of her term of service, with as good wearing apparel as she now takes with her to Litchfield. Casualties of death and abandoning from service accepted. Brickley described another child who came to the Tallmadge house. She noted, Benjamin Tallmadge bought musty or part Indian, part Black 3-year-old boy to be his servant for 21 years. This may be the child Tallmadge wrote to his daughter Maria about in an undated letter from Washington where he served in Congress from 1801 to 1817. He said, my dear little daughter, can you, with the aid of your brothers, do anything toward learning Igbo to read? I really should rejoice beyond measure if any progress could be made in this respect by him. Let me hope that you will at least make the trial. A reward shall accompany success. This paternalistic view was apparently shared by others in Litchfield. Brickley wrote, in 1816, Benjamin Tallmadge, then in Washington, D.C., wrote to Tapping Reeve in Litchfield that the new plan of colonizing the Negroes seems to gain ground. Tallmadge saw colonization as a solution for both the Southern slave owners, to whom free Blacks would be, quote, dangerous neighbors, and to New Englanders, who as Christians wish it well, quote, for the sake of millions of his heathen brethren. Lynn continued, New Englanders embraced the doctrine of colonization of free Blacks back to Africa as an alternative to accepting them within their own communities. She says this was the sentiment of all of Litchfield's leading families well into the mid-19th century. Another African-American who worked for Tallmadge did so under an employment contract. Cash Africa was also a veteran of the Revolutionary War. Brickley's research indicates that in 1788, Tallmadge hired Cash Africa to work for 40 shillings a month for half of his time, with suitable boarding and lodging. We know from records at the State Archives that Africa sued Deborah Marsh of Litchfield in 1777 for illegal enslavement. He claimed he was unlawfully seized with force of arms and compelled to labor for the defendant for 3 years. We also know a little bit about his marriage from this advertisement. A year prior to working for Tallmadge, she placed this ad in the Litchfield Monitor, notifying everyone that he would not be responsible for his wife's deaths after this date, as she had run away from him. Finding records of undocumented populations in the archives can be challenging, but it is important. Historians look in places you might not have expected, like account books, receipts, and even works of historic fiction. Providing item-level description is time-consuming and difficult, but sometimes it's the only way we can reveal evidence of the lives of those who did not have wealth or power. The people we encounter this way cannot be fully understood through something like an account book entry for the purchase of an orange. But occasionally, like with Cash Africa, we can assemble a few such bits of information to find out a little bit more about a human life lived. Thank you for joining us for the Coffee with the Curators series about Benjamin Tallmadge, and thanks very much to West Group Law, PLLC, for sponsoring our Secrets of the Spymaster series. You can see here and on our website that we have 3 more events in this series coming up this week, as well as 1 more blog post this Thursday, and you can go to our website for further information about any of these and to register.